Yes, this is another couple different stories, one from LA and one from New York. And I'll set up this way, which is like imagine that you had a loved one who was being kept alive by a drug, and the hospital said, we're going to discontinue the drug. And hopefully, by the time we run out of the supply, this new experimental drug that really doesn't work and costs 10 times as much will be reliable and affordable. And like you'd think, well, if you're going to discontinue something that works, you'd better have a proven replacement ready to go. But what we're seeing in across the country, but in particular here in LA and New York, is shutting down and blocking fossil fuel projects, and then just having a fantasy or a hope that they're going to be able to be replaced ultimately by solar and wind before residents become starved for energy. So in LA, they're abandoning plans to rebuild three natural gas power plants. And this is part of the whole goal of becoming 100% renewable, or the actual law that's been implemented in the state. And the mayor, even the way he put it, is now is the time to start the beginning of the end of natural gas. And the idea is that they're just going to ultimately be able to rely on solar, wind, and batteries, even though LA's own utility officials have said just in the last year that batteries charged with solar and wind aren't yet able to provide cheap, reliable energy enough to replace gas plants, and that we would actually risk power outages for 4 million people in the area. And the mayor's answer was, well, we just need to shift our thinking. Like, I mean, literally, that's the answer, is that we won't have trouble keeping the lights on if it's just batteries and clean energy technologies. You just need to think about it differently. And in New York, there's been much the same. So New York naturally just has an incredible amount of natural gas, but they can't actually get it for themselves because they have a ban on fracking. And so they rely on imports of natural gas for their energy, but they've also blocked and delayed all these new pipeline projects. And so a few weeks ago, we talked about how there was even one town in New York where they're basically putting a moratorium on hooking people up to natural gas because they say, look, we don't even have enough. So you have a state that has a natural gas shortage, and over the next couple of years, they're going to be shutting down two nuclear reactors that together supply a quarter of New York City's electricity. And the idea is, well, we'll replace them with natural gas, but they have no plans to build more pipelines. And so the New York Public Service Commission chairman, John B. Rhodes, his answer to this is, well, we're looking at clean alternatives. And so I think in both these cases, you see that like the people who are sort of championing the Green New Deal and all these 100% renewable plans, the only actual plan, the only thing that they really have a checklist that they can implement is outlawing practical energy. And then all they have as a solution is a fantasy and a hope that renewables will somehow bail them out of energy starvation. And I mean, this is so reckless and irresponsible. And yet the fact that people aren't concerned about this, but they're concerned about, a temperature rise in a century, I find really astonishing.
One thing that is so important to grasp and is hard to grasp is just how large numbers of people can be very wrong, and including how societies can make enormous mistakes that contradict the knowledge of experts, or at least knowledge you would sometimes the knowledge of experts, or sometimes knowledge you would expect experts to have. But it's worth thinking about, when are there these mass delusions that nobody is talking about, and that seem to just take everyone by surprise. You can think about the mortgage crisis / financial crisis of 2007, 2008, and how little anticipated that was, at least how many people thought, yeah, there are no, and the causes of those are very involved. But just if you take like mortgage lending practices that didn't make sense, there are certain people like Warren Buffett, I've been reading a lot recently, who are just saying, okay, these practices don't make sense. You can't just assume housing prices will always go up in the way that you are, and the actual economics are off. But when there are enough, here's what works. Here's the way these things work. If there are enough quote unquote expert people who either say something is good or who don't protest it, there's an understandable calm that we have about it. We think, okay, well, there can't be that much of a downside. And I want to just try to institute in people's mind that no, you cannot feel comfortable just because there aren't experts that are protesting. You might think, oh yeah, well, people won't let these mortgage lending practices out of control, or they won't go out of control because just there are too many people whose job it is. Or I just was thinking of a different example that I forgot of. But another example that's come up recently is the example in the last several years of the company Theranos, which a bunch of my friends have been talking about. There's a new podcast about it called The Dropout, which seems to be pretty good journalistically. And I know someone who's an insider there and at least seems to have a decent opinion of the accuracy of that so far. And what you see with Theranos is it's a situation where there was a technology. This is my current understanding, so I haven't looked into this in depth, but the essential idea that a drop of blood, like by pricking your finger and getting a drop of blood, you could replace a huge amount of the functionality where people normally draw vials of blood. And there were very, very elite people like George Shultz, who's actually a Republican climate catastrophist, whom we're still trusting on that. But there are all sorts of prestigious people who were involved with this, including professors, and who were, and if you looked at the number of people promoting it, the media promoting it, the people who have responsibility to fact check, you think, okay, there's no way that this technology just doesn't work. And yet that's what seems to be the case. The technology just didn't work. There was something fundamentally wrong about it, and people just didn't get it. And the mainstream knowledge system, including many thought leaders, just failed. So what can we do as consumers? Well, one thing is if something doesn't make sense, then really challenge it and see if somebody has an argument. So if somebody says, hey, we're going to use unreliable fuel sources and we're going to power the whole grid on that, ask them, how is this possibly going to work? I don't understand how it's going to work. I understand how it works if you have 100% life support from these reliable sources, but if you ban those, how is that going to work? Like, okay, you have storage, but look at how much the storage costs. The storage costs like hundreds and hundreds, thousands of times more than you would need it to for it to be okay. And even then, you need to totally build way, way more of these unreliable power things. And even how are you going to do that? And how are you going to overcome all the obstacles there? If you have one of your weapons is just having common sense and ignorance and the ability to ask quote unquote ignorant, maybe a better term is innocent questions, and just do not assume that everyone knows what they're doing, because often people in the know, one of their rationalizations is think, well, nobody will really take this seriously. So they feel like, yeah, I'm a power operator. Yeah, I know that this is a bad idea, but somebody else will step in. And then what happens is nobody else steps in. And then the stakes become higher and higher. And then you feel more and more isolated saying something. And then you get these kinds of disasters. So as just intelligent, ambitious citizens, we cannot have confidence that just everyone knows what they're doing, particularly if they're doing something that defies our common sense. It might make sense, but it might not.